is Earnshaw from NEC, for those of you who don't know me. And I'm here to talk to you about the practicalities of managing compensation events in the real world, I think is the important bit there. Because the theory of the contract is one thing, how it's supposed to be done. Many of us know how it should be done, but many of us also experience how it's actually being done. So when you find yourself in those situations, how do you deal with them? And importantly, how do you try to avoid ending up in those situations in the first place? So my focus is more on compensation events, not really going into the process in much detail. We're looking at how do you assess them and manage the assessment of them. So I'll do a very little bit about me just to sort of explain why I'm here and what my background is. Very little bit on procedures, but mainly about principles. And then how does case law inform us about how to assess compensation events as well? Then I've come up with 7 pillars for assessing compensation events properly. The Earnshaw pillars, they shall be known as from this point on.
We're ready.
We'll look at timescales, again, theory versus reality. And 6 simple tips to keep us out of trouble. And then I'm going to illustrate this with a case study. From my own experience, the facts have been embellished, as all my stories are, but also I've anonymized it and used a bit of artistic license to bring out some of the themes that we often find in our projects. This one project is not the first and only project I've experienced with these issues. And then more tips on how to make proper assessments of compensation events. The final point disappeared at the last minute, so I won't be doing useful resources. There's many useful resources sat around the room. But if you do look back at previous NEC conferences, there are a lot of resources that have already been published and spoken about. There's a paper that I think Sarah contributed to. John, I know, spoke on the subject a few years back as well. So there's an awful lot of resources. And we're all saying the same thing in different ways about how to effectively manage them. So, jumping into me, been doing NEC for a long time. You couldn't have stage managed this any better. Just then, before I started speaking, a gentleman walked up to me and he said, "You won't remember me, will you?" I went, "Yes, I do. I saw your name in the programme. It's Sean. We were on that job together 30 years ago." And that was my first NEC job. Now, that was a little side job. The one with Sean was a target cost contract, but bespoke IChemE contract. But I learned all the things I know about how to do collaboration right from that job. Because that was in the sort of formative stage of my career. And whilst it wasn't without its challenges, it did go really well. Okay? So doing NEC for a long time involved, in the procurement as well as the management of NEC contracts, done a lot of NEC training courses for a long time now, and increasingly getting involved with helping clients to resolve complex contractual issues and disputes. So the principles, remember, principle number 1 of NEC, it was trying to reduce the incidence of disputes in construction. So all of our objectives when we start a new contract should be about how do we stay out of trouble? How do we work together so that doesn't happen? Because that is fundamentally the underlying principle of the contract. We know the 3 objectives: clarity, flexibility, and stimulation to good management. And hopefully we know that the stimulus to good management is arguably the most important of those objectives. More cooperation, more efficiency, and fewer disputes. Now, I'm trying to be more upbeat because the last morning session was a bit of a heavy ending, and I was feeling a bit downbeat at the end of it, going, it's all rubbish, isn't it, out there? And I do sometimes feel that way as well. So I'm going to try and be more positive about this. To say, surely we're doing things better now than we did in the bad old days. So moving on then, again, a little bit on the contract. The project manager has a duty to assess compensation events. First, it's the contractor who assesses them in their quotation, but if the project manager doesn't like the assessment, it's their duty to make an assessment of it. You see the word I'm stressing all the way through here. 4 reasons for the PM to assess if they don't like the contractor's numbers. Again, I don't want to go through those. Most of us should be familiar with what the contract requires, okay? Also requires the PM to assess the program for remaining work in certain circumstances as well. So what does assessment mean? So some instruction here. If it's good enough for Susie Dent, it's good enough for me. Evaluate or estimate the nature, ability, or quality. But for those of us who need a bit more persuasion, that Keating says it suggests a judgment or appraisal being made. So what do those words mean? Okay? So how does case law inform us? How does case law really help us with this? Now, this is not in chronological order. It's in the order I thought made sense. Most of you should be familiar with that case. If you're a project manager and you're not, you need to get reading quickly, because it's very instructive, and I'm not sure it's ever actually been tested. I don't think it has. I don't think it needs to be, because I think the support is now confirming that the project manager, when assessing sums payable, has a duty to act impartially between the two parties. Impartially. So as project manager, you are not there when you're assessing things on behalf of the client, with the client's hat on. You are independent, like an adjudicator would be, like an arbitrator would be, or like a judge. Costain-Bechtel confirmed what had been said many years before that, exactly 50 years ago, because that's the year I was born in. Sutcliffe and Thacker. You see this idea that the project manager in an NEC contract wears two hats, two functions. Act on client's instructions is one hat, but the other hat is act on your own opinion. Do not be led by the client. And you can see that the second paragraph there, the architect, in this instance, it was a JCT contract, has to apply professional skill. So when applying professional skill, has to act in a fair and unbiased manner in applying the terms of a contract. Okay? Now, going back further to a Canadian case, because sometimes it ends up where, for the want of evidence, we don't pay somebody. The easiest way to not pay for something is to just ask for more information. You've not justified it, is my favourite bugbear. I need all of the information before I can make a decision here. In this case, you can see what's happened. And what they're saying is, look, it might be difficult, but that does not relieve the employer of their liability to pay. So it might be difficult to come up with this assessment. It may be a matter of guesswork, but you still have a duty to do it. If you know something's changed, if you know there's been a delay, some additional work done, you could almost forget about the contractual niceties. You've got to make an assessment. And if you can stand there, go on the job and look at the thing that was the varied work, or you can see evidence of the delay, then your job is to come up with some form of assessment, even if you are struggling to get information about it. If you know it's happened, the assessment cannot be zero, cannot be nil. It has to be something. What's the expression? For the want of a nail, the war was lost, or the battle was lost. So, this time we have a position where the quantity surveyor cannot ascertain, as a JCT contract requires, unless a massive amount of detail and supporting documentation is provided. It says it's almost akin to saying the contractor must produce all conceivable material evidence necessary to prove its claim beyond all reasonable doubt. But it goes on to clarify that no, you just have to be satisfied that some or all of the loss expense claimed is likely to be or has incurred. Satisfied. And you see further down there, because what the judge is saying here, that if we end up in tribunal, the decision will be made on the balance of probabilities, not beyond all reasonable doubt. So the tribunal will only have to be satisfied that the contractor probably incurred. Probably. Balance of probabilities. How certain do you have to be about your assessment? Balance of probabilities, 51% certain that it's right or about right. Yeah, I think often with our compensation events, we end up in the realms of beyond all reasonable doubt. And that's where things start going wrong for me. Also, he went on to point out that in a JCT contract, it also doesn't just deal with loss or expense that has been incurred, it deals with loss and expense that has not yet been incurred but is likely to be incurred. And in the absence of crystal ball gazing, they cannot be certain precisely what will happen in the future, but they need only be satisfied the loss or expense will probably be incurred. How certain can you be in an NEC contract about a forecast of defined cost or a forecast of planned completion? You can never be 100% certain. Another case, Lillian McKay. You can see the criticism here. Every conceivable detail and backup documentation which may or may not be needed must be provided, and all evidence required to prove the claim is correct needs to be deployed. And the judge pointed out that this is absurd. A position where you might have £1 million claim, and for the want of detail on £10, you deny the whole claim. Absurd is the word he used. And for me, I like the expression that the architect and the quantity surveyor apply equally to the project manager, yeah? And not strangers to the project. You're involved in the project day to day. You know what's gone on. You know what's happened and why. Yet when it comes to assessing compensation events, we just base our decisions based on what we see within the four corners of the submission. That's got to be wrong. So, remember the message here is about not having to be certain, balance of probabilities, that loss, expense in a JCT contract, defined cost, impact on planned completion in NEC, just have to be more certain than not that it was incurred. So, taking from that my 7 pillars, PM is independent certifier must do the best they can to produce a fair and reasonable assessment in an unbiased manner, as well as in compliance with 10.1 and 10.2. Yeah? So this is not a fudge, this is overlaying what's already there. It's imposing a higher duty, I think. Okay? Second one is, it may impose a higher duty. So I had an adjudication that informed me a couple of years ago on this, where the project manager had not assessed an extension of time for a compensation event that increased the contract value by 50%. And in adjudication, when questioned why, the project manager said the contractor didn't ask for one. Yeah? Was the project manager right? We got our extension of time. And I think this is why it imposes a higher duty, because maybe had the project manager, in the unlikely event this ever happens, had the project manager bit the hand off the contractor and gone, oh yeah, I'll have some of that, I'll accept your quote first time round, no extension of time. Maybe that would have been fine. But it was the fact that he went on to make his own assessment that increased the bar maybe. Now you're not doing it right, because you have to do it fair and unbiased and in accordance with the contract. And the contract, which we clearly pointed out in adjudication, says you've got to assess time and money. And it increased the value by 50%. Anybody can see that's going to have an impact without even knowing the details. The third pillar is, remember, we're assessing on the balance of probability, more likely than not that it was incurred. Okay? The fourth one, remember, not a stranger to the project. Don't stay within those four corners. You've got to look at all the information available to you to produce a fair and reasonable assessment. Because all too often when I see commercial people involved in compensation events, they act like they've just been born. I'm sorry, I'm new here. You have to prove it to me. The project manager's nowhere in sight on some of these big projects. Different teams, different departments, different personnel. For me, that client should get the house in order. That's the problem, not the contractor. Remember, even when assessment is difficult or seemingly impossible, it doesn't relieve the client of liability to pay or an obligation to pay, even if the assessment is, at best, a guess. As long as you have genuinely made a genuine attempt to produce a fair and reasonable assessment, it doesn't matter if it's wrong. Yeah? It's about having that legitimate attempt to do it. I did the best I could with the information that was available to me. Yeah? And remember, this crystal ball doesn't exist. I know a lot of clients think it does, and a lot of client advisors think it does. You know, the argument contractors. Well, you shouldn't have done it like that. I wouldn't have done it like that. I've never seen it done like that before. All those kinds of arguments that you hear. Yeah? So we can never be certain, and deliberately so, in big letters. I'm talking about the project manager, but the project manager isn't one person. It is a team of people, usually, especially on big projects. So these duties apply to all of you on the client side, all of you advising the PM. You're trying to achieve the same aim, okay, and are bound by the same rules. So, what do you think? Earnshaw's 7 pillars? Is there merit in it? So, CE timescales, the theory, sorry, not the theory, what the contract states, yeah? Hopefully, again, most of you are familiar with those timescales. Wouldn't that be wonderful? What it tells you, I think, is if we stuck to the timescales, 5 weeks is the shortest period. If the event at the left is a PMI, 3 weeks to submit quote, 2 weeks to make a decision. Oh, I accept it. So 5 weeks. But we know we often get stuck over at the far end there. Quotation submitted, reply, reject. Takes us back 5 weeks, back through the same cycle. Maybe that's what we're seeing in the survey happening. An implementation at the end there, when the PM either accepts, God forbid, or makes an assessment, implementation gives us finalization, doesn't it? Now, my question is this. Why is there no mechanism for the PM to change a decision about an implemented CE if they realize they made a mistake? When things turn out different, when their approach appears maybe to have been flawed for how they've tackled earlier CEs. There's no mechanism, or is there? Because there's a compensation event, is there not? Project manager changes a decision. So the contract provides for decisions to be changed, does it not? Or does it? That's the question. Because the contract's supposed to bring finalization, but it might be a door open for the PM to change a decision. Being in breach of contract because there's no express provision in the contract that allows it, but there is a remedy for it. Whereas what the PM does, in my experience, is just shut up shop. I'm sorry, I've made my decision. If you want a different decision, you've got to go and speak to the client. I'm sorry, I think whilst you are carrying out the function of project manager, you are also advising your client, which might be the conversation that happens, which says, look, I've made a decision, but I think you should do this. I'm advising you as my client. I can't do it. I'm tied in the contract. But you can do whatever you want to do as client by agreement, by consent with the contractor. And I think we might need to do something different here. Why don't people advise their clients in that way? Why are they just binary PMs? Yeah? I just realized what I said. I'm in Yusuf's position now. Not meant in that way. Okay. As in one-dimensional would have been a better expression. Okay? So, now, I'm not the first person to have thought this. If you dig back to an article that Humphrey Lloyd wrote in the NEC newsletter a few years ago, he was sort of suggesting this might be a good idea. He also said, it could be said that if the trust and confidence called for by clause 10.1 is present, then why should advantage be taken of a mistake? I suggest the NEC should be clarified to make clear the circumstances in which one of the project manager's decisions could be changed. So it's not just Neil Earnshaw saying this, and I didn't find that out until I was doing the research for this. And if it's good enough for Humphrey Lloyd, it's good enough for me. If you don't know who he is, Google him. But I would be worried. So, moving on then. So, that's just a thought for you there. Looking at the timescales then, in the real world, well, you've seen the survey results. Now, Glenn said nothing much has changed. In summary, I saw something else. I mean, generally, I saw them supporting what I see on my projects and the anecdotal evidence I hear from all the training sessions and all the rest of it. But I saw that. And if you look at the change in that from 2014, so over 10 years, the number of compensation events taking longer than 6 months has doubled. Doubled. Yeah? That's a big change. It's a small one on the graph, but it's doubled. And I wonder if the example I've got is the reason for that, or one of the reasons behind it. So, my 6 tips, I'll come back onto that in a second. Firstly, ensure the parties have aligned objectives from the start. The aligned objective being proactive management of compensation events. Get to the end with a small gap. The smaller the gap at the end, the better the result for the parties. The more predictability of outcome both parties will have throughout. And there should always be 2 senior people, one from each side, who have an eye on that throughout, who can talk to each other when things are building up, when they're not getting implemented, to say, what are we going to do about this? Is it more resource? Is it a lack of understanding? Do we need somebody else to come in? What are we going to do to resolve these issues? Another one, make sure the quotation template is in accordance with the contract and agree with the PM. Just do it at the start, it's dead easy. The number of compensation events that get rejected that I see because the format's just wrong, that it's not being done correctly. Having an agreed template would help with that. Agree the level of detail needed to substantiate quotations. Again, at the outset, before there's any money to argue about. Do you need chapter and verse for everything? What's a reasonable level of substantiation? Keep good records, the facts, as well as what happened and why. Okay? Use an online contract management tool to store all the records in. And when I say all the records, I mean all the records, not just the NEC records. Okay? I'm advising on a tricky compensation event at the moment. And the tool, the contract management tool, has been a blessing in disguise. I have been searching for fun in there and finding everything. That's a lot easier than how we used to have to do things. Keyword searches, linkages between different events, but also remember all the records are in there. The labour and plant returns are in there, the photographs are in there, the progress reports, the meeting minutes. They're all in the system. So searching for stuff becomes easier, which means you can get to the answer quicker. And ensure the team remains focused on proactive management throughout, even when things get tricky. Especially when things get tricky. That's the time to pull together to solve the problem, not to fall apart. Okay? So, Max Abrahamson, a titan of construction law, yeah? 3 important things. You should drill this into your teams repeatedly. There are only 3 important things: records, records, and records, yeah? I don't know, has the discipline slipped that I saw 30 years ago of keeping site diaries? Do we still have that discipline? The day worksheets that are signed off by the person who was there, that you can hold up 2 years later and go, look, I've got a record of how long it took and what was there. Do we still have the rigor that we used to have? I'm not sure. So my case study, I'll let you digest. £40 million project, 2-year program, client design. A lot of key dates and sectional completion dates because the facility has to remain operational. Yeah? And losses if it doesn't remain operational, hence hefty delay damages. This is where we're at. 300 early warnings, good, bad, or indifferent. I'm in the same camp as Glenn and John. What is the right number? Some. Yeah? PMIs, circa 900 PMIs. Yes, sharp intake of breath syndrome. I refer to it as death by 1,000 cuts. Not just from this project, I've seen it on multiple projects. 400 CEs, guess what they all relate to pretty much? Yep, you guessed it. PMIs for scope changes. Remember, client design, traditional procurement. ICEs, new term, implemented CEs, is what that means, yeah? 300. So we've still got a lot in play, haven't we? 25% of the CEs are still in play. Now, at this point, a deal had been done. So a deal had been done to amend the contract duration, sweep things under the carpet. So we step outside the NEC framework and we do a deal because it was getting tricky. That deal happened after the first 100 compensation events. 300 more down the line. Where's this going to end up? And then since then, we only have 5 that have an EOT that amounts to 30 days. Anybody smell something fishy? So the forecast program duration is 173 weeks. After the CEs and the amendment, we're at 147 weeks. So we've still got a gap, haven't we? And at the moment, the contractor's staring at a gap with £10,000 a day in it. So we have a problem. Forecast total of the price is 60 million now. Remember, we started at 40. And after the amendment and the implemented CEs, we're still £10 million apart. Now, if this contract was being administered correctly, as in accordance with the contract, there's £10 million there because it's option A that hasn't been paid. Now, I think it's a good thing that the project manager has chosen not to do that and to pay on account for the things they know. The things they know will have an impact, that they've made an assessment already that we know there's some money there. So I'll give you some money on account. Not in accordance with the contract. 10 million quid difference, though, could send a contractor bust. Back to Yusuf's point. Yeah? So the question is, was NEC's complex contract machinery designed for this sort of project? What's the problem? Is it the people or the contract? Hopefully you recognize the gentleman on the right-hand side of the screen there. In what may be one of the last recorded videos that Martin did, he said this, a reminder that this should never have happened. How do you end up with 900 instructions to change the scope? He talked about the scope being rubbish, the design being incomplete, and the whole basis of NEC was don't do that. Don't go out to tender until you've done it. When you know what you want, go out to tender. When you've got 900 instructions, was the design actually finished at that stage? Okay? So there's a question mark, and I've seen it on multiple projects where we go out too soon, maybe? Or maybe we choose an inappropriate procurement strategy. Because NEC was not designed for that. It was designed that you would have sorted out your design. And it would be complete. And there would only be, and I couldn't find the source, but again, in one of the early texts that I've seen a paper published by Martin in, he says that there should be barely any compensation events because you've sorted the design out. So how do we end up in a situation where we've got hundreds of the things of all the jobs we work on, when he was of the view that shouldn't hardly have any? Also, he said in the same interview, and this is on the NEC's website, if you look at the video, the NEC story, and everybody this should be day one NEC, watch this video. This is what it is, this is why we need it, okay? But he did have some things to say about the compensation event process. There are some things we still need to improve. It's proving too complicated for people. It's putting them off. I think we should overhaul it. This was in 2012. Okay? So, some food for thought. So, going back to my case study. Okay. Yeah. So, this was a challenging project. Okay? A lot of change happened quickly. There were lots of large compensation events as well. Resource-constrained project. It's in the middle of nowhere. You can't just get people to come and work on it like this. So they were just overwhelmed with what was going on with them. And there was just a build-up. So that's where hopefully I came in to try and assist, to try and help unblock the problem. And the big positive here was that there was a good relationship and commitment from the team. The relationship had been built, so the trust was there to be able to do what happened next. So firstly, quick wins. Clear out the detritus. It's a distraction. The small value stuff, get rid of it. Have a quick look at it. Is it there or thereabouts? Accept it. Get rid of it, because it's a distraction. You'll spend more time arguing about over 20 little things than the one big thing that's the elephant in the room. So look for the quick wins, identify them, quick review, try and get them accepted to clear the trash out of the way. Now the PM, again prior to my involvement, agreed to a super CE to wrap up multiple smaller ones that impacted the same area at the same time. Not in accordance with the contract, but it's what was agreed. So I had a notification of a compensation event that re-notified half a dozen previous compensation events. Asked me where the dividing date was. What the fair dividing date would have been. Quotation is for circa £5 million and 26 weeks of delay. 2 weeks to decide whether to accept it or not, yeah? So after 3 rounds and 6 months, change the approach. Because this was all being done by me remotely. So we're just playing ping pong, okay? So change the approach to stop the to-ing and froing. 3 strikes and out is my golden rule with compensation events. If you've rejected it 3 times, Mr. Project Manager or Mrs. Project Manager, make an assessment. Yeah? It's easy to do this when you've got a good relationship. Don't just push it back to the contractor. Find some spurious reason to reject it and say, no, do more work. Do your own work. I have spent a long time researching this project to find out what happened and why. And today, I have found no evidence of any wrongdoing on the part of the contractor that explains this big gap. So is there anything there, really? Or is the problem that the contractual machinery has broken down, that extension of time maybe should have been awarded and weren't? That's what I suspect has happened. The other thing here is to be clear about what's agreed and what's not. I can't tackle £5 million in one go. Break it down into smaller bite-sized chunks. Okay? And when you've agreed it, okay, it's agreed. As soon as you start unagreeing it, changing your mind and shifting position later, chaos. The trust and confidence disappears. Because that's what it is. That's what's keeping us out of trouble, is that trust and confidence, the fact that nobody's doing anything that they could do contractually about this. So once it's in a box, leave it there. Move on to the next piece of the jigsaw. Okay? What's the expression? You can't eat the elephant in one go or something? So, quite a few tips here. So, if you're on the contractor's side, written narratives to explaining numbers are powerful. It's not just numbers. What do they mean? What are they based on? Yeah? Do not put in baseless claims, because that works against the trust, the confidence, the spurious claims, the dreamt up things. Yeah? Just be straight down the bat. If you're entitled to it, you should be paid it. You shouldn't need to dream things up. Base your quotation on the reality of what's happened, because if you don't, and somebody looks at it very closely, they will find out that you weren't telling the truth about what happened. When you can say, same job, but a year earlier, reviewed a compensation event, contractor claims for all the prelims on the job. And I'm thinking, hang on, this delay happened at the start. All the prelims weren't there. I asked the site supervisor for a photograph from the period. Empty field. Not good, is it? So, also don't expect the PM to just accept what you're saying at face value. Expect to justify things. Expect to have to provide more evidence to a point, yeah? Again, you can sort this out at the start. What justification do we need to provide? Okay? Flexibility is the key to compromise. You're going to let some stuff go if you're going to get it agreed. You won't always be right. PM's side now. If there's something you don't agree, again, explain why in sufficient detail. A written narrative. That's what the contract requires us to do in NEC 4. Personally, I didn't need those words in NEC 4. I was doing that anyway. Yeah, because I thought that was good project management. But the words are instructive. Spurious reasons for rejection, again, undermine confidence and trust. So make sure your reasons are real. Remember that the CE has already been conceded. There's no argument about principle at this stage. It's just about time and money. How much and how long? The principle went a long time ago. Don't expect the contractor to be able to justify everything. They won't have records for everything, for how long it took to do everything. There won't be the records for that. Delay often doesn't happen in a nice, neat, self-contained way where you could record it on a day worksheet. Okay, but you will have other evidence. It's about the level of detail we're asking for, yeah? I had a contract recently where the project manager was asking for records that did not exist. And the contractor had stated, we don't have them. Historically, we don't have them. We've never been asked by you as a client for these before. And we don't have those records yet. They kept banging the drum, demanding the records were provided. You can't produce what you've not got. What do you want them to do? Just make it up? I'm sure you don't want them to do that. Find other ways. So we convince them to look at gate access records, yeah? Go and interview the person to find out what they were doing. Do they have any understanding of the job, or is it just a made-up person? Ask to see what emails they've been sending. Again, flexibility is key. So, just to wrap up, from a paper from a long time ago by John Carlyle, who did a lot of research into partnering back in the day. Yeah, it is hard. It's easier to not do this, but we know where that leads us. So let's not do that, okay? Thank you.